Hi, this is Ms. Lancaster doing our weekly check-in for Chapter 8. Okay, so we're continuing on with the inequality chapters. Chapter 8, it has to do with dominant minority relationships in relationship to race and ethnicity. So one of the things that I really want you to take away from this chapter is that there is a dominant minority relationship based on our race and our ethnicity. Okay, so stratification we learned in Chapter 7. About how stratification exists in society to kind of categorize us and layer us within various categories. So chapter 7 was focused mostly on income and wealth and those type of social class type differences that stratify us, that create whether we live in poverty or not. And then we talk about life chances. Well, chapter 8 focuses on how race and ethnicity can shape where we fall in stratification. Okay, so if you remember back to last chapter, ascribed stratification systems are systems that are shaped around stratifying individuals based on on situations that they cannot have any control over, right? So that's an entire system that's based around it. If we think about the caste system, the estate system, things like that, you're born into these ascribed systems that then shape us, right? We live in a system that is an achieved stratification system. So in an achieved stratification system, it means that we can acquire our position. Unfortunately, though, our ascribed statuses, right, things that we're born with that we may or may not be able to control, right, can shape the opportunities that we have within our open class achieved system. And that's what this chapter is about. Chapter 8 is about race and ethnicity. Race and ethnicity are both socially constructed ideas. So hopefully you'll take that away from the chapter. Race is a socially constructed idea that's based on perceived biological differences, the physical things that we can see that make us look different. But in reality, it's just a very, very small little piece of our genetic code. There is no gene specific to race. Okay, so race is a socially defined category about those perceived biological differences, those physical things that we can see, but we're really not all that different in the big scheme of things. There's actually more difference or variety amongst people of the same race than there is amongst the differences amongst different races. Okay, so race is something that's been created by society and has been used to kind of in many ways justify the differential treatment that has existed. Ethnicity is a cultural difference, but again, it's a perceived cultural difference that makes us see things differently, right? So if we think back to chapter 3, where we learned about culture, we understand that there are subcultural ideas, there are dominant cultural ideas. Ethnicity is really just the fact of whether we follow a culture of our origin, right? So there are different types of ethnic groups, there are different types of ethnicity, there's situational and symbolic, kind of understanding that sometimes we use our ethnicity to kind of benefit us and sometimes it hurts us, so we will avoid it. Right, thinking about passing, we learned about passing in chapter 6, but now we come back to it to kind of think about it. Key things, because this chapter is about dominant minority relationships, if I'm part of the dominant group, I am going to benefit. If I'm part of the minority group, I'm not, right? So kind of recognizing minority doesn't have anything to do with numbers per se in a sociology class as much as it has to do with power. Okay, so if I'm part of the dominant group, my group actually maintains the power, and in many ways I may benefit. The concept of privilege shows up in this chapter in the form of white privilege. Hopefully you have taken the privilege test that I've given in the last chapter to kind of recognize that privilege exists in many different ways, shapes, and forms. That is a piece of intersectionality, that I may be privileged in some ways, but disadvantaged in other ways. That's intersectionality. So privilege is used in our society, this term privilege is used in our society in a very negative way, but I want us to recognize that privilege is something that's unearned. We didn't ask for it, but we have it. And it's important that we recognize when we do have it, right? More likely than when we only recognize it when we lack it, right? Which is what tends to be the most common. Some other things to kind of think about in this chapter, you'll be learning about stereotypes. You'll be learning about prejudice. you'll be learning about discrimination and racism. Okay. So what I want us to recognize is that these are all factors that kind of relate to one another. Prejudice is not the same thing as discrimination. And racism is this overarching idea. It is macro level. It is not a micro level thing. It is a macro level thing that can ripple into the micro to shape our interactions. So any of the isms are institutional arrangements that shape, right? That shape the way we see our world. Okay, so a stereotype can lead to a prejudice. A prejudice is a overall an idea or an attitude, a belief that we may have about a category of people, but we may not actually act on that prejudice. The action is the actual discrimination. Okay, so recognizing those key differences between that. Prejudice is something that all of us have in some way because stereotypes exist. We recognize them. Prejudice are not necessarily always a bad thing because they kind of give us some sort of expectation of what's going on. It's when we act on it that it can be problematic. There's a fair amount of videos that I've shared in this chapter in the module. I highly recommend that you watch as many of them, if not all of them as possible. I would really want you to watch them all, but I do understand that sometimes students aren't able to, okay? There's a difference between individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is when it's built into the system, and that's when we start to get into racism, okay? Individual discrimination is when I treat you differently based on my own perceived ideas about you. That is an individual one. I myself, there's no institutional rule that's kind of guiding my behavior. It's me, myself, recognizing that. Okay, the theories are really, really important. This chapter, recognizing the functionalist perspective can get a little bit confusing because it really talks about how motivation is extremely important. We must motivate the most talented individuals to take on those roles. So motivation is extremely important. And so therefore stratification is extremely important. Following our culture is extremely important, right? However, discriminating against somebody is dysfunctional. Okay, so it gets a little confusing. Please feel free to ask some questions about that theory because it does kind of seem kind of two-sided. It's saying we shouldn't discriminate because that's dysfunctional for society. However, those that don't fit into the cultural norms need to grab a hold and do that, right? So it's kind of in some ways can come across as kind of blaming the victim for their own discrimination. However, when we think about assimilation exists in order to bring everybody into the same cultural group. What happens though is, some groups are able to assimilate a little better than or easier than others. If I look like the dominant group, I can much more easily assimilate in than if I don't. Okay, so when we think about ethnicities in variation in comparison to race, our racial differences are much more seen than our ethnic differences. Think back to, 100 years ago, Italians, Irish, these individuals were not well liked in our society. They have a lot of negative stereotypes against them. They were not individuals that were easily accepted. However, today we don't really even see that as a minority group at all. They were not white, but now they are. Why? Because culturally they were able to shift and assimilate and then eventually blend in with the dominant group. However, if my racial characteristics, my skin tone can shape and change the way people see me, it may be harder for me to fit in. So recognizing that. The conflict perspective, of course, again, talks about how different dominant minority relationships are shaped and shape what goes on in society. There is an unequal distribution of resources around life chances in relationship to race. If I'm part of a minority group, I'm much more likely to be struggling, right? So kind of recognize that inequality that exists. Notice what they kind of in many ways are saying, that we, as our society, we kind of pit minority groups against one another as well, because if they argue amongst themselves, they may not recognize that they're all equally being oppressed by the dominant group. Symbolic interactionism is really a huge piece of understanding how race and ethnicity are socially constructed, gaining our meanings and our understandings from society. The reason that we think that race matters is because society has made it matter. And because society has made it matter, it does matter, right? See, this is a piece of that colorblind racism that exists that as you're reading through it, symbolically, we have kind of created this idea that we need to be colorblind in order to not see race. But the problem is, if we don't see race, we won't see the problems that exist based around race. Okay, so this is why colorblind racism is in this textbook, to kind of recognize just because we say we don't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? If I say this, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a problem, right? Just because I say there's not a problem, it may be that there's not a problem to me, but it could be very much a problem to you. The more we shove stuff underneath the rug, eventually you will trip over the rug. Okay, so kind of recognizing that. The last thing that I want you to kind of focus on is really looking at life chances and how our racial categories and our ethnic categories can shape the opportunities that we have for education, the opportunities that we have for health, for wellness in general, the type of jobs that we may or may not do, where we live. A long history of discrimination has impacted different individuals differently. And think about that. Race relationships have always existed, and racial relationships will continue to exist, and they can range anywhere from genocide to segregation to pluralism, right? So bringing us back to that multicultural idea that we talked about in chapter 3. So I'm trying to keep this a little short. Let me know if you have any questions. Make sure that you watch the videos that I've given you. Don't forget to do your data workshop, your inquisitive, and your discussion board. Don't wait till the last minute to do that discussion board. The sooner you do it, the sooner that myself and your classmates can answer questions that you have before you take your quiz. All right, have a great day.